You think you know what it means to be a god of war. You admire the legends of the East, the warriors of the three kingdoms, and the silent strength of the saints. But there is a name that once made the very foundations of the civilized world tremble in absolute terror, a name that echoes through the corridors of history not as a man, but as a nightmare. We often ask ourselves what makes a leader great. Is it the blood they spill, or the legacy they build for their people? Today, we peel back the shroud of time to look at a figure who stood at the crossroads of empires and demanded they all burn. Before we are finished, you will have to ask yourself, in the scales of power, who truly weighs more, the heroes we worship or the monsters we fear? To understand the shadow that fell over Europe in the 5th century, you must understand the Huns. They were a shadow people, emerging from the vast, unforgiving steppes with no written history, only a reputation for brutality that preceded them like a foul wind. For a long time, the Roman Empire barely acknowledged them, dismissing them as mere savages. That changed when two brothers stepped into the light, Bleda and Attila. While Bleda was content with the spoils of the moment, Attila saw the world as a chessboard. He didn't just want gold, he wanted the fear of every living soul. After nearly 2 decades of joint rule and the eventual, mysterious disappearance of his brother, Attila stood alone. He was no longer just a king of a nomadic tribe, he was the Scourge of God. Imagine the atmosphere of that era. Rome, once the eternal city, was a crumbling relic, split into east and west, gasping for air as barbarian tribes nipped at its heels. Into this decaying grandeur comes a man who didn't care for Roman law or Christian mercy. He was a tactician who understood that the greatest weapon isn't the sword, but the psychological collapse of your enemy. When Attila moved, the earth itself seemed to groan. It was said that where his horse set foot, grass would never grow again. This wasn't just a military campaign, it was an existential threat. But every dark thriller needs a catalyst, a moment where a single choice ignites a global fire. In this story, that catalyst was a woman named Honoria, the sister of the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III. Trapped in the suffocating gold cage of the Roman court and forced into an unwanted engagement with a boring senator, Honoria did the unthinkable. She sent a letter and a ring to Attila. Some say it was a plea for rescue. Attila chose to see it as a marriage proposal. He claimed half of the Western Roman Empire as her dowry. It was the ultimate political extortion, a move so audacious it left the Roman Senate paralyzed. He wasn't just invading, he was claiming his rightful bride. The conflict reached its breaking point on the Catalonian plains in modern-day France in the year 451. This wasn't just a skirmish, it was a clash of civilizations. On one side, Attila and his horde of Huns, master archers who could shoot a bird out of the sky while galloping at full speed. On the other, a desperate coalition of Romans and Visigoths led by Flavius Aetius, a man who had once lived among the Huns and knew their secrets. The air was thick with the smell of horse sweat and iron. As the sun began to set over the plains, 60,000 men stood ready to die. This was the first time Attila met an equal on the battlefield. The battle was a chaotic meat grinder. Theodoric, the king of the Visigoths, fell in the heat of the fight, his body trampled by his own cavalry. In the darkness, the lines between friend and foe blurred. Attila, sensing the tide turning against him for the first time in his life, prepared a funeral pyre of wooden saddles. He intended to burn himself alive rather than be captured. It is a haunting image, the world's most feared conqueror sitting atop a pile of leather and wood, torch in hand, waiting for the end. But the end didn't come. Aetius, playing a dangerous game of shadow politics, allowed Attila to retreat, fearing that if the Huns were completely destroyed, the Visigoths would become too powerful. Attila escaped, but the myth of his invincibility had been cracked. Hungry for vengeance and nursing a wounded ego, Attila turned his eyes toward Italy. He wasn't just looking for land anymore, he was looking for blood. He razed cities to the ground, leaving nothing but smoking ruins in his wake. The refugees fled to the lagoons of the Adriatic, inadvertently founding what would one day become Venice. As he marched toward Rome, the city was in a state of absolute panic. There were no armies left to stop him. The emperor was ready to flee. The end of Western civilization seemed to be a foregone conclusion. Then, one of the most mysterious encounters in human history took place. As Attila's army sat on the banks of the Mincio River, a small delegation arrived from Rome. At its head was Pope Leo I. There were no soldiers, no walls, just an old man in white robes meeting the man who called himself the Scourge of God. Historians have debated for centuries what was said in that tent. Did the Pope offer a massive bribe? Did he warn Attila of the plague ravaging his troops? Or did the sheer, dignified presence of the spiritual leader intimidate the barbarian king? Whatever happened, Attila turned his horse around. He abandoned his march on Rome and retreated to the Danube. The final act of this thriller is perhaps the darkest of all. Despite his failures in Gaul and Italy, Attila remained a titan. In the year 453, he decided to take another wife, a beautiful young woman named Ildiko. The wedding was a spectacle of excess, a night of heavy drinking and celebration. Attila, the man who had survived 1,000 arrows and outsmarted the greatest generals of Rome, retired to his chambers in a drunken stupor. The next morning, his guards grew worried when he didn't emerge. When they finally broke down the doors, they found a scene of silent horror. Attila was dead, lying in a pool of his own blood. The cause of death remains one of history's greatest cold cases. Some say he suffered a massive internal hemorrhage, a simple nosebleed that choked him in his sleep because he was too intoxicated to wake up. Others whisper of a more sinister plot, that Ildiko was an agent of the Romans, or that he was poisoned by his own inner circle. There are even darker theories of ancient curses catching up to a man who had spilled oceans of blood. Regardless of how he died, the reaction of his warriors was legendary. They didn't just weep, they cut their hair and gashed their faces with swords, mourning their king not with tears, but with the blood of men. Attila was buried in a triple coffin, one of gold, one of silver, and one of iron. To ensure his final resting place remained a secret, the captives who buried him were slaughtered immediately afterward. To this day, the grave of Attila has never been found. It lies somewhere beneath the Hungarian soil, a hidden monument to a man who nearly ended the world. Within a few short years of his death, his empire vanished. It was a structure built entirely on the strength of a single personality. Without Attila, the Huns were nothing but a memory. When we look back at the giants of history, we see that power is often a fragile thing. It can conquer continents and humble emperors, yet it can be extinguished by a single letter, a silent prayer, or a broken blood vessel in the middle of the night. Attila the Hun reminds us that the line between a hero and a villain is often drawn by the survivors. He was a man who understood the value of his people and sought to elevate them by tearing everyone else down.
Onward to greater.
He didn't play by the rules of the civilized world because he saw that those rules were designed to keep people like him in the dirt. So, who was truly greater? The Roman generals who used gold and treachery to survive, or the barbarian who forced them to look into the mirror of their own hypocrisy? We often idolize the warriors of the past for their courage, but we forget the cost of their ambitions. Attila's story isn't just a history lesson, it's a cautionary tale about the nature of absolute power. It shows us that an empire built on fear is an empire built on sand. When the wind changes, the sand shifts, and everything we thought was permanent disappears into the mist. As you sit here today, in a world that feels just as volatile and uncertain as the one Attila walked through, remember that the Scourge of God was, in the end, just a man. He was a man who could be moved by a letter from a desperate princess and halted by the words of an unarmed priest. History is not just a collection of dates, it is a series of human moments, of risks taken and conflicts resolved in the shadows. The next time you see a statue of a great conqueror or hear the name of a legendary hero, look closer at the darkness behind them. You might just find that the most terrifying figures in history are the ones who remind us most of ourselves: ambitious, flawed, and ultimately mortal. The empire of the Huns is gone, but the name Attila remains etched into our collective consciousness. It serves as a reminder that no matter how high we climb or how many enemies we defeat, we are all subject to the same silent hand of fate. The dark thriller of the 5th century didn't end with a grand finale on a battlefield, it ended in a quiet room, with a man who had conquered the world unable to survive his own body. That is the ultimate irony of power. It can give you the world, but it cannot save you from yourself. And as the sun sets on the legends of the past, we are left to wonder whose hoofbeats will be the next to shake the earth. Until then, the ghost of the Scourge of God continues to haunt the ruins of the empires he tried to destroy, a silent witness to the endless cycle of rise and fall.